The first thing Julian Mercer noticed when he finally stopped running was how loud silence could be. Not the kind of silence you get in penthouses with thick glass and private elevators. Not the curated quiet he used to buy with money and control. This was different. This was the silence of a place that did not care who he used to be. A bus terminal at $2.17 a meter smelled like wet concrete, cheap coffee, and tired bodies. The fluorescent lights were too bright and too honest. They showed everything Julian had tried not to see for most of his life. Cracked knuckles, worn shoes, eyes that learned early not to ask for kindness. Julian sat on a plastic bench with a duffel bag between his feet and a cardboard box pressed tight against his chest like a shield. Inside the box were the things he had grabbed without thinking. A framed photo of a skyline he once owned in pieces. A watch that no longer felt like victory, and a stack of documents that meant nothing now that every account had been frozen. A TV mounted high in the corner played on mute, but the captions were enough. Meridian Capital CEO resigns amid fraud allegations. Coup claims he was misled and betrayed. Whistleblower promises more to come. Julian's name slid across the screen in a clean white font like a funeral announcement. Beneath it, footage of him from a year ago. Tailored suit, controlled smile, confident stride. That version of him looked like he could bend the world with 2 fingers. This version sat hunched in a coat that was not warm enough, staring at a vending machine that asked for $3 he did not want to spend. He had once spent $3 million without blinking. The betrayal had been surgical. Not dramatic. Not the kind people wrote books about. It was the quiet kind that happened in conference rooms and compliance reports. The kind that made you doubt your own memory. It had started as a whisper in his legal team's tone. A pause before answering. A glance exchanged between 2 people who suddenly did not want to meet his eyes. Then came the emails he had never sent. The wire transfers he had never approved. The offshore accounts opened under his signature. And then, the hand that had placed the knife. Caleb Rourke, his chief operating officer, had stood across from him in the boardroom with a face that looked exhausted and righteous, as if he was the one carrying the weight of the world. Caleb had been Julian's right hand for 8 years. Ate at his table, spoke about loyalty like it was a creed. "I'm sorry," Caleb had said. "They're coming for you." I tried to stop it. Julian had watched him speak and realized, with a cold clarity, that Caleb was performing. Not apologizing, acting, planting the final impression. A few hours later, federal investigators arrived at Meridian Tower. The doors that opened for Julian automatically for a decade did not open that day. Security asked for his badge. His assistant avoided his gaze. The elevator did not recognize him. The building he built no longer knew his name. Someone in the crowd outside shouted, "Thief." Someone else shouted, "Monster." Julian did not correct them. He could not. Even if the fraud was not his, the monster part had always been more complicated. Because it was true that he had taken. Power wasn't just gained in Julian's world. It was extracted. It was forced. It was squeezed out of people with weaker leverage. He had told himself it was simply business, that no one made it to the top without stepping on a few hands. But the hands were attached to people, and people had families, and families had consequences. Those consequences were here now, in a bus terminal, where nobody cared about his old excuse. A man slept on the floor nearby with his head resting on a backpack. A woman whispered to a toddler to stay quiet. A teenager stared at a cracked phone screen with the dead-eyed patience of someone waiting for a life that never arrived. And a few rows down, a boy of about 10 sat alone at a table meant for 4. The boy had a paper cup of water, an oversized hoodie, and a face that looked too serious for his age. He was not crying. That's what made him harder to ignore. Crying was familiar. Crying was loud. Crying could be dismissed as temporary. This child's stillness looked permanent. Julian glanced away, irritated at himself for noticing. He had built a career on not noticing. He had trained his mind to see people as numbers, obstacles, tools, threats. It was cleaner that way. But tonight, his mind refused to be clean. The boy stood and walked toward the vending machines, digging into his pocket with small, deliberate movements. Coins clinked. He counted twice. Then he stood still, staring at the buttons like each one might bite him. Julian watched without meaning to. The boy pressed a button. Nothing happened. He pressed it again. The machine blinked an error message and swallowed the coins anyway. The boy's shoulders tightened. His jaw clenched. He did not throw a fit. He did not plead with anyone. He just stared at the glass, behind which a single granola bar sat like a joke. Julian recognized that look. It was the look of someone realizing the world had no intention of being fair. He had worn that look once, decades ago, before the suits, before the power, when his father's hands had trembled over unpaid bills at a kitchen table in a rented apartment. Julian shifted on the bench. His fingers tightened around the edge of the cardboard box. He told himself to stay out of it. He told himself he was not the man who handed out charity to strangers at $2.17 a meter, but he was also no longer the man who could buy his way out of guilt. The boy turned away from the machine, swallowing disappointment like it was routine. His eyes darted, not begging, not asking, just scanning for what was possible. And then the boy's gaze landed on Julian. For one strange second, Julian felt seen, not recognized as the billionaire, the headline, the villain. Seen as a tired man with a box in his arms like a person packing up his own life. The boy hesitated, then walked closer. Not all the way, close enough that his voice carried. "Mister," the boy said, careful, as if he didn't want to provoke anything. "You got any water?" Julian blinked. "There's a fountain by the bathrooms." The boy nodded, but he didn't move. "It's broken." Julian looked toward the bathrooms. A handwritten sign taped to a door confirmed it. Out of order. The boy shifted his weight. "They want $3 for this," he said, holding up his paper cup. "But I can't." Julian heard himself answer before he decided to. "How much did it take from you?" The boy glanced down. $2.25. Julian's throat tightened. $2.25 was nothing to him, and yet it was everything to a child in a bus station. Julian reached into his pocket. His hand stopped. He remembered, sharply, how many times he had done this in the past, not for kindness, but for control, tossing money at problems so they would stop being noisy, buying silence, buying gratitude, buying distance. But the boy's eyes were not hungry for Julian's money. They were hungry for relief. Julian pulled out a $5 bill. It was wrinkled, like it had been folded too many times. He didn't even remember how it ended up in his coat. Probably a remnant from a life that used to require cash for valets and tips. He held it out. The boy stared at it like it might be a trick. Julian kept his voice steady. "Go try again. If it steals from you, hit the side. Machines act better when they're afraid." A small smile flickered at the edge of the boy's mouth, then vanished. He took the bill with both hands, like it was fragile. "Thank you." The boy moved back to the machine, pressed a button, and this time the machine clanked and dropped the bottle of water. He picked it up and looked back at Julian, then walked toward him again. Julian expected the boy to keep the water, to drink it fast, to guard it. Instead, the boy twisted the cap off, took one sip, then held the bottle out toward Julian. "You look like you need it," the boy said. Julian froze. For a second, his mind refused to accept the offer. Water from a child who had just been robbed by a machine. Kindness from someone who had every reason to keep what little he had. Julian stared at the bottle. The boy's arm remained extended, unwavering. Julian took it. The plastic crinkled under his fingers. He lifted it and drank. The water was cold and clean and ordinary, and it hit his throat like a confession. He hadn't realized how thirsty he was. When he lowered the bottle, he found the boy still watching him, not judging, not celebrating Julian's weakness, just present. "What's your name?" Julian asked. The boy blinked, like names were not always safe to share. "Micah," Julian nodded. "You traveling, Micah?" Micah shrugged. "Just waiting." "Waiting for who?" Micah looked away. "Someone who said they'd come." Julian understood too well what it meant when someone said they'd come. He watched Micah sit at the table again, shoulders hunched, water bottle in his hands. And for a moment, Julian's brain tried to do what it always did: calculate, assess, identify risk, identify purpose. But there was no purpose here. No leverage, no advantage. Just a child waiting in the middle of the night. Julian's phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him. The screen lit up with a notification from an unknown number. "No one is coming to save you. Sleep with one eye open." Julian's stomach dropped. He stared at the message, heat spreading through his chest like poison. He knew that voice. Not the exact words, but the intention. The taste of it. Caleb. A reminder that Julian was not just ruined financially. He was exposed, vulnerable, alone. Julian typed back without thinking, "Who is this?" The response came immediately. "You know who." Julian's hand shook. He clenched the phone until his knuckles went white. He looked around the terminal. People moved in slow patterns of exhaustion. A man in a knit cap shuffled past, carrying a trash bag like it was luggage. A woman sat on the floor, charging her phone from a wall outlet. Nobody looked like a threat. Everyone looked like a survivor. And Julian suddenly understood something that terrified him. In his old life, danger wore suits and smiled across mahogany tables. It spoke politely while it planned your destruction. In this place, danger could wear any face. It could approach you with a question and a knife behind its back. Julian forced himself to breathe. He turned his phone face down on the bench and stared at the floor, trying to steady the spinning in his head. This was rock bottom. Not because he lacked money, but because he had no idea who was coming next. He had no allies left. The lawyers had stopped answering. The board had issued statements. His friends had become careful. His family had been distant long before all of this. Julian Mercer, once untouchable, now sat in a bus terminal and realized the truth he had spent a lifetime outrunning. He had built an empire made of distrust, and it had finally collapsed under the weight of its own emptiness. A soft sound made him lift his head. Micah had stood up again. The boy walked toward him, slower this time, as if approaching something fragile. Micah reached into the pocket of his hoodie and pulled out a granola bar, the same kind the vending machine had refused to give him. Wrapped in plain foil, cheap, ordinary, Micah held it out. Julian stared. "Where did you get that?" Micah shrugged. "A man gave it to me earlier." Julian glanced around, expecting to see the man, but nobody was looking. Nobody was claiming the moment. Micah's hand stayed extended. Julian's throat tightened again, harder this time. "You should keep it." Micah shook his head once. "You look like you didn't eat." Julian felt something crack inside him, not in a dramatic way. In a quiet, humiliating way, like a wall giving up after years of pressure. He took the granola bar. His fingers brushed the boy's for a fraction of a second, and the boy flinched, not in fear of Julian, but in instinct, like touch had not always been gentle in his life. Julian held the bar and looked at Micah. "Thank you," he said, the words rough in his mouth. Micah nodded, as if gratitude was not the point. Then he turned and went back to his table, leaving Julian sitting there with a cheap granola bar in his hand and a $5 bill missing from his pocket. Julian unwrapped it slowly. The foil crackled loud in the terminal's late-night hush. He took one bite, and as he chewed, he felt the strangest sensation. Not relief, not hope, curiosity. Because something was happening around him that did not fit his old worldview. A child offering his only food. A stranger's quiet generosity. A terminal full of people who had nothing and still shared. Julian looked back down at his phone, still face down on the bench like a warning. Then his gaze shifted to the cardboard box in his arms. A box full of symbols from his old life. And in that moment, as the echo of betrayal still rang in his bones, Julian did not yet understand that the lifeline coming toward him would not be loud. It would not be announced. It would not demand credit. It would arrive the way mercy often does, quietly, from the last place he would ever think to look, and from someone whose name he had once dismissed as unimportant. Julian Mercer did not sleep. He tried at first, the way exhausted people try, by forcing his eyes shut and pretending the body will obey. But every time he drifted toward rest, the message on his phone returned like a hand around his throat. No one is coming to save you. Sleep with one eye open. The words were simple, almost childish, and that was what made them cruel. Caleb Rourke had always known how to make danger feel casual. Julian had once admired that trait. Now it felt like a disease. He sat upright on the bench, the cardboard box in his lap, the granola bar, half-eaten and forgotten. A terminal hummed with late-night life, a slow tide of strangers who did not care about his collapse. Julian listened to the noises. A janitor's mop swishing over tile, a baby's soft whimper, the distant cough of someone who smoked too much and slept too little. He watched Micah from a distance. The boy had returned to his table, arms folded on the surface, chin resting on his sleeves. He stared at nothing for long minutes, like a child trained to wait without hope. Every so often, he glanced toward the entrance. Each time the automatic doors slid open, Micah's posture lifted slightly, then dropped again when it was not the person he expected. Julian found himself counting those moments, even though he had never once counted a child's disappointments before. At 3:04 a.m., Micah stood and walked to the corner where the charging outlets were. He plugged in a battered phone and sat on the floor, back against the wall, eyes open and unfocused. He looked older than 10 in the way only neglected children can. Julian's stomach tightened. He told himself he should not get involved. He told himself he had no right to insert himself into anyone's life. His hands were not clean. His history was not kind. But Micah had offered him water. Micah had offered him food. That kind of kindness did not belong in Julian's world. It did not fit any formula of power and exchange. It sat there, quiet and stubborn, like a truth Julian had spent years trying to bury. He reached for his phone again. The screen lit up with another notification, this time from a news app. Meridian Capital's creditors moved to seize assets. Former employees speak out about toxic culture. Investigation expands. A photo accompanied the article. Julian at a gala, smiling beside politicians and donors, his hand resting lightly on a glass of champagne. The caption described him as a corporate titan, an architect of aggressive growth. Julian stared at the word architect and thought of what his buildings had been made of. He remembered a Tuesday 5 years ago, a day with rain pounding the windows of Meridian Tower, when an employee had asked for 2 weeks off to care for a sick parent. Julian had been running late for a board call, already angry about numbers, already feeling cornered by investors. He had looked at the request like it was an inconvenience. "Then you're not committed," he had said. The employee's face had fallen. Julian had seen it and done nothing. He had learned early that empathy slowed you down, and slowing down meant someone else passed you. He had fired the employee the next day, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to remind the entire floor who decided what mattered. That was Julian's cruelty. Not shouting, not violence. Just decisions made cold and clean, leaving wreckage behind him. Now, as the terminal's fluorescent lights buzzed above his head, Julian realized the wreckage had names, faces, children, futures. He read another message, this one from his former assistant. Elena, I'm sorry. I can't be associated with this. They're asking questions. Please don't contact me. Julian typed back, then erased it, then typed again. His hands shook. Caleb's betrayal had done more than destroy his reputation. It had isolated him completely. Julian had built a life where every connection was conditional. Now that the conditions had collapsed, so had the connections. He looked up and caught the reflection of himself in the dark glass of the terminal's storefront. The man in the reflection looked older than he should. His eyes were rimmed red. His jaw was tense, like he was bracing for a blow. Julian had spent years believing he was the predator. Tonight, he felt like prey. A soft shuffle came from the side. An older homeless man had sat on the bench a few feet away, carrying a plastic bag and a blanket rolled tight. His hair was gray, his face lined, his hands cracked. He looked like he had been surviving longer than Julian had been winning. The man nodded once in Julian's direction, not friendly, not hostile, just acknowledging his presence. Julian hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. Do you know if this place is safe? The man studied him. Safe is expensive, he said. Julian swallowed. I used to be able to afford it. The man's expression did not change. Then you're learning something. Julian almost laughed, but the sound died in his throat. I don't know who's after me. The man shrugged. Could be nobody. Could be everybody. That's what happens when you fall. Julian stared at the floor. How do you live like that? The man looked away, toward the entrance, as if watching the world instead of fearing it. You stop believing you can control it. Julian's throat tightened again. Control had been his religion. A loud click echoed through the terminal as the TV volume suddenly turned on. A reporter's voice filled the space, crisp and hungry. Tonight, the fallout continues from Meridian Capital's stunning collapse. Former employees describe a workplace culture of fear and silence under CEO Julian Mercer. One former staffer said, quote, if you had a family emergency, you hid it. If you were sick, you hid it. If you were human, you hid it. Julian felt the words land like stones. Across the terminal, Micah lifted his head at the sound. His gaze drifted to the screen, then to Julian, as if connecting the story to the man sitting alone with a box in his arms. Julian wanted to disappear. The automatic doors hissed open again, letting in a gust of cold air and the scent of rain. A figure stepped inside, shaking water from a hooded jacket. They moved like someone who knew exactly where they were going. Julian's body tensed, instinctively ready for danger. But the figure did not look at him. They walked to a nearby trash bin, dropped something in, then kept moving. Still, something about the motion felt deliberate. Julian waited until the person was out of view, then stood, forcing his legs to cooperate. He moved toward the trash bin, trying to look casual, trying not to draw attention. His heart hammered. Inside the bin, on top of the paper cups and wrappers, sat a folded envelope. No stamp, no name, just plain white paper. Julian stared at it, heat rising under his skin. He looked around. No one was watching. The homeless man on the bench had his eyes closed. Micah was back on the floor by the outlets, head down. Julian picked up the envelope and slipped it into his coat pocket like contraband. He returned to his bench and opened it carefully. Inside was a bus ticket. Destination, Brookhaven, one town over. Departure, 4:10 a meter. Alongside, it was a note written in neat block letters. Do not go back to your apartment. They are waiting. Take the first bus. Ask for MRS. Dalton at the day shelter. Julian's throat went dry. He read the note again, then again, slower, as if repetition would change its meaning. Someone knew where he would go. Someone knew Caleb's next move. And someone, for reasons Julian could not yet understand, was trying to keep him alive. Julian's first instinct was to reject it, to assume it was another trap. Caleb was clever enough to create false lifelines. Julian had seen him manipulate entire teams with a smile, but the warning about his apartment hit too close. Julian's luxury building downtown had already been swarmed by reporters earlier. Caleb could easily predict Julian's habits, his old escape routes, the places he would run when he had nowhere else. Julian's hands trembled as he folded the note. He glanced toward Micah. The boy was watching him again, eyes sharp in a way that didn't match his age. Micah stood slowly and walked over, stopping a few feet away. You're scared, he said. Julian swallowed. Yes. Micah stared at the envelope in Julian's hands. Someone helping you? Julian hesitated. I don't know. Micah nodded as if that made perfect sense. Help feels weird when you're not used to it. Julian looked at him, startled. How would you know that? Micah's face hardened for a brief second, like a door closing. Because nobody helps for free. Julian's chest tightened. That's not always true. Micah tilted his head. You helped me. But you didn't do it because you love me. Julian flinched because the child was right. Julian had helped because it interrupted something inside him, not because he had trained himself to love strangers. Julian had not been that kind of man. Micah continued, voice quiet. Still counts, though. It still helped. Julian looked down at the bus ticket again. The departure time was close. He could feel panic creeping in, pressing against his ribs. Micah glanced at the automatic doors, then back to Julian. If you leave, you'll be gone before my person comes. The words landed like a small knife. Julian stared at the boy. Your person is coming? Micah's jaw tightened. They said they would. Julian felt anger flash. But not at Micah, at the invisible adult who could leave a child waiting in a bus station through the night. Julian forced his voice calm. What if they don't? Micah did not answer. Julian took a breath. He looked around the terminal. He had no money, no car, no safe place, no allies. He had a threatening message, a bus ticket from a stranger, and a child waiting for someone who might never arrive. A strange thought crossed Julian's mind, almost absurd. In his old world, he would have solved this with one phone call. A driver, a hotel, security, a private suite, a controlled environment. Now he had none of those. All he had was choice. Julian stood slowly, lifting the cardboard box. Come with me, he said to Micah. Micah blinked. Where? Julian held up the ticket. A shelter in Brookhaven. Someone there? A Mrs. Dalton? Micah's eyes narrowed. You don't even know who wrote that. I don't, Julian admitted. But I know I can't go back. And I know you shouldn't be here alone. Micah stared at him with the suspicion of a child who had been disappointed too many times. Why would you take me? Julian's throat tightened. He could have lied. He could have said something noble. But lies had built the empire that was now ashes. So he told the truth, or at least the beginning of it. Because you gave me water when you didn't have to, Julian said. And because I think I've spent my whole life walking past people like you. I don't want to do that tonight. Micah looked away, jaw clenched. Then he looked back and nodded once. Okay, he said, like he was agreeing to something heavy. Julian's phone buzzed again. A new message. You think you can run? You can't outrun what you owe. Julian's stomach dropped. He shoved the phone into his pocket and tightened his grip on the cardboard box. Micah stepped closer. "We gotta go now," he said, suddenly urgent. Julian glanced at the departure time. 4 to 10 a.m. It was 3:52. Julian nodded. "We go now." He did not know who had left that ticket. He did not know why they cared. He did not know what waited in Brookhaven. But as he and Micah walked toward the gate together, Julian felt the echo of something unfamiliar inside him. Not power, not control, a quiet, unsettling pull toward redemption. And somewhere in the city behind them, a person who had every reason to hate Julian Mercer was choosing, silently, to keep him alive. The bus to Brookhaven smelled like damp fabric and old heat. Its seats were worn smooth, the kind of wear that comes from years of people sitting down with nowhere else to go. The overhead lights flickered slightly, as if even electricity was tired. Julian Mercer stepped onto the bus, with Micah close behind him, holding his hoodie sleeves over his hands like gloves. Julian's pulse hammered so loudly, he could hear it in his ears. Every instinct told him to keep moving, keep scanning, keep controlling the variables. But the variables were no longer his. He was not the man with the private jet and the security detail. He was a man with a cardboard box in one arm, a bus ticket that had appeared like a ghost, and a child who had agreed to trust him for reasons Julian did not deserve. He chose seats near the middle, not too close to the driver, not too close to the back. He set the cardboard box down between his feet and sat with his shoulders stiff. Micah slid in next to the window and looked outside as if he was memorizing the terminal's lights in case he needed to find his way back. When the bus doors hissed closed, Julian exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. He pulled out his phone without thinking, then stopped. The last messages sat like poison on the screen. The battery icon glowed red. He had no charger, no safe place to call, no one to call. Micah glanced at the phone and then at Julian's face. "He's still texting you," Micah said, not a question. Julian's jaw tightened. "I don't know if it's him." Micah's eyes stayed on him. "You do." Julian looked away. A child shouldn't be this perceptive, he thought. But children who grow up in unstable places learn to read danger the way other children learn to read books. The bus pulled out of the station with a groan, tires hissing over wet pavement. As they merged onto the highway, the city lights began to thin and fade. Julian watched buildings recede into shadow, each one a reminder of what he had once owned, or at least controlled. Micah leaned his forehead against the window, the glass fogged under his breath. Julian looked at the boy's reflection in the dark, and the weight of the night pressed down on him again. "Micah," he said quietly, "who are you waiting for?" Micah kept his eyes on the road. "My mom's friend? And your mom?" Micah's silence answered before his mouth did. "She's not around." Julian's throat tightened. "I'm sorry." Micah shrugged, but it was the kind of shrug that tried to make grief small enough to carry. People say sorry a lot. It doesn't change stuff. Julian nodded, because Micah was right. Julian had used apologies as currency in his own world. He had said sorry when it was convenient, when it preserved relationships that benefited him. He had offered apologies, the way corporations offered settlement money. But real sorrow had a different shape. Real sorrow sat in your chest and made you want to do something that cost you. Julian did not know how to do that yet. He only knew how to run and build and win. And now he was running without winning. The bus rocked gently as it gained speed. Julian's exhaustion hit him in waves. His eyes burned. His body felt hollow, but he forced himself to stay awake. The note had said they were waiting at his apartment. Caleb's message had said he couldn't outrun what he owed. Julian had no idea what owed meant anymore. If it meant money, he was ruined. If it meant revenge, he was exposed. If it meant guilt, He had been carrying it for years without naming it. Micah's breathing slowed. The boy's head slipped sideways against the window, and within minutes he was asleep. His mouth fell open slightly, a child's vulnerability showing through the hard shell he wore while awake. Julian watched him and felt a quiet ache. Micah shouldn't have to sleep on a bus with a stranger. Micah shouldn't have had to ask for water. Micah shouldn't have had to offer food to a grown man who had once ruled a city. But the world didn't care what should be. Julian stared down at his hands. He used to wear cufflinks. Now his fingers were stained with ink from opening envelopes and folding notes. His skin looked paler under the bus's harsh lights. He looked like someone who had been drained. Half an hour into the ride, the driver's radio crackled faintly with dispatch chatter. Julian caught fragments of words. Police, report, terminal, mail, possible incident. The driver kept his eyes forward, expression unreadable. Julian's body tensed. He leaned slightly toward the aisle, trying to listen. The radio crackled again. Be advised, officers responding, possible assault. Suspect left the scene. Julian's stomach dropped. He pictured the bus terminal. He pictured the older homeless man on the bench. He pictured the woman with the toddler, the teenager with the cracked phone. He pictured Micah's table. Had something happened after they left? Was it connected to him? Julian's mind tried to spin scenarios. Caleb's men arriving. Someone looking for Julian. Someone getting hurt because Julian had been there. Julian's hands tightened around his knees. He realized, with a cold shock, that even now his first thought was not compassion. It was liability. It was consequence. He hated that about himself. He sat back, forcing his fingers to unclench. He glanced at Micah, still sleeping, and felt a different kind of responsibility settle into him, heavier than fear. When they reached Brookhaven, dawn was still far away. The bus pulled into a small station that looked like it had been built for a town half its size, and then forgotten. A few streetlights flickered over puddles. A diner across the road glowed faintly, its sign buzzing like an insect. The rain had softened to a mist. Julian nudged Micah gently. Hey, he murmured. We're here. Micah blinked awake, instantly alert, like sleep was never fully safe for him. He sat up and looked around, and pulled his hood up tighter. They stepped off the bus together. The cold hit Julian's face like a slap. He held the cardboard box under his arm and kept Micah close, scanning the empty station. A couple stood by a car with a sleeping baby. A man in a work jacket smoked under the awning. No one looked like they cared who Julian was. That should have been comforting. It wasn't. Julian led Micah across the street toward the diner, not because they needed food, but because light meant witnesses. He pushed through the door, and the warmth hit his skin. A bell jingled. Inside, the diner was almost empty. A waitress wiped down a booth with slow movements. A man sat alone at the counter drinking coffee, his cap pulled low. A radio played soft old music. The waitress looked up. Her eyes slid over Julian's face and lingered for half a second longer than normal. Julian's stomach tightened again. Did she recognize him? Then her gaze moved to Micah, and something softened in her expression. You too need a booth? She asked. Julian nodded. Just coffee. And maybe something for him. Micah sat stiffly, watching the room like a cornered animal. Julian set the box on the booth seat beside him. The waitress brought a cup of coffee for Julian and a glass of water for Micah. Then she placed a plate in front of Micah. Scrambled eggs, toast, and a small bowl of fruit. Micah stared at it like it was unreal. Julian frowned. I didn't order that. The waitress shrugged. Kitchen did it. Julian followed her gaze toward the man at the counter. The man lifted his coffee cup slightly, not smiling, not friendly, just acknowledging. Julian's chest tightened. Who is he? Micah whispered, That's the guy who gave me the granola bar. Julian stared at the man. The same cheap granola bar. The same kind the vending machine had refused to give. The man's hands were rough. His jacket looked like it had seen too many winters. He did not look like someone who had any business orbiting Julian Mercer. Julian's mind wanted to label him threat, ally, spy, nothing. But the man didn't fit any category. Micah hesitated, then picked up the toast and took a bite. He chewed slowly, eyes half-lidded, as if tasting safety more than food. Julian watched, and the ache in his chest sharpened into something like shame. He had fired people for asking for time off to care for family. He had treated human vulnerability like a weakness to exploit. And now a stranger was feeding a child without being asked. Julian's coffee tasted bitter. The waitress returned, setting down a napkin and a small packet of jelly. "You're looking for Mrs. Dalton?" she asked casually, as if she were asking if Julian wanted cream. Julian's heart kicked hard. "Who told you that?" The waitress gave him a look that said he wasn't as invisible as he thought. "You're not the first lost soul who came through here with that name on your mind." Julian forced his voice steady. "Yes, we are." The waitress nodded toward the back. "Shelter's 2 blocks down. Brick building, blue door. You'll see it. She'll be there soon. She likes to get in before the sun." Julian stared at her. "How do you know she'll be there?" The waitress's expression stayed neutral, but her eyes were not. "Because someone asked me to keep an eye out for you." Julian's hands went cold. "Who?" The waitress wiped her hands on her apron, then leaned slightly closer. "Don't ask questions in the open," she said quietly. "You're not in a boardroom anymore." Julian's stomach twisted. Micah swallowed another bite and looked up. "You're shaking," Micah whispered. Julian hadn't noticed. He forced his hands to still under the table. He tried to breathe like a man who was not being hunted. The man at the counter stood up and placed cash on the surface. Even though the diner was cheap, and he didn't look like he had much to spare, he put his hat on and walked toward the door. As he passed their booth, he paused. Julian looked up, ready for confrontation, ready for accusation. The man's eyes met Julian's, sharp and tired, like someone who had seen the worst of people and still chosen to stay alive anyway. "Don't go back," the man said softly. Julian's throat went dry. "Who are you?" The man's gaze flicked to Micah, then back to Julian. "Someone you don't remember." Julian felt the words hit him like a punch. The man continued, voice low, almost gentle. "There's a place that'll take the boy. But you," he said, eyes narrowing slightly, "you have to decide if you're just passing through, or if you're finally going to face what you did." Julian's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The man walked out into the mist and disappeared. Julian sat frozen. The diner suddenly too warm, too bright. Someone you don't remember. Julian had wronged so many people, he couldn't remember them all. That was the truth he had always avoided. Cruelty at scale becomes forgettable for the person delivering it. But for the person receiving it, it becomes a scar that shapes their entire life. Micah finished his toast and looked at Julian. "He's not mad," Micah said, as if analyzing a puzzle. "Not like he wants to hurt you." Julian's voice came out rough. "How can you tell?" Micah shrugged. "If he wanted to hurt you, he wouldn't feed me first." Julian swallowed hard. He looked out the diner window at the wet street, the mist, the dim streetlights. He felt like he was walking deeper into something he couldn't control. But the help kept coming, quiet and unclaimed. A bus ticket, a note, a meal, a warning. Someone was guiding him like an unseen hand, not dragging him back to his old life, but pushing him toward something he didn't want to face. Julian stood slowly. "We should go," he said. Micah slid out of the booth, pulling his hood tight again. Julian grabbed the cardboard box, now heavier than ever, not because of what was inside, but but because of what it represented, they stepped back into the cold. 2 blocks down, as the waitress had promised, a brick building sat in the mist with a blue door. A single light above it glowed like a small mercy. Julian stood in front of it, hand hovering near the knob, heart pounding. Because once he walked through that door, he sensed he wouldn't just be asking for shelter. He would be stepping into the echo of his own past. And somewhere inside, the person he did not remember was waiting to see what kind of man Julian Mercer would become when no one was watching. The blue door opened before Julian could knock. A woman in her late 60s stood in the doorway, small but sturdy, with silver hair pulled back and eyes that missed nothing. She wore a thick cardigan and a lanyard with a keyring that looked like it belonged to someone who managed more than locks. The scent of disinfectant and old coffee drifted out behind her. She looked at Julian first, then at Micah. Her gaze lingered on Micah, the way a lighthouse lingers on a ship in rough water. "Come in," she said, not asking, not welcoming either, just issuing a fact. Julian stepped inside with Micah at his side. The hallway was narrow and warm. A bulletin board held flyers about job programs, grief groups, and free counseling. A handwritten sign listed rules in block letters. Nitrogen monoxide fights, nitrogen monoxide drugs, nitrogen monoxide stealing. Respect is not optional. Julian's stomach tightened at the last line. He had never lived under rules he didn't write. The woman led them into a small office with a desk, 2 chairs, and a lamp that cast soft light onto stacks of paperwork. A space built for triage, not comfort. She sat down and motioned for them to do the same. Micah sat immediately, shoulders tucked in, as if he knew how these places worked. Julian remained standing for a beat too long, then lowered himself into the chair like it was a negotiation. The woman folded her hands. "Micah," she said. Micah blinked. "Yes. You hungry?" Micah's eyes flicked to Julian. He hesitated, then nodded once. The woman pressed a button on the intercom. "Kitchen, peanut butter sandwich, fruit, milk, and a blanket." She released the button and looked back at Micah. "Someone will bring it." Micah nodded again, his face trying to remain tough, but his eyes softening at the word blanket. Julian watched the exchange and felt a strange pressure behind his eyes. It wasn't tears. Not yet. It was the sensation of witnessing competence that wasn't flashy, care that wasn't performative. The woman turned her attention to Julian. "And you," she said, voice even, "are Julian Mercer." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a guess. Julian's body went rigid. His mouth went dry. He had been hoping foolishly that in this town, in this early hour, he might still be a man without a headline. He wasn't. Julian forced his voice steady. "Who are you?" The woman didn't blink. "Mrs. Dalton," Julian swallowed. The note had said ask for Mrs. Dalton. The waitress had said she would be there soon. Here she was, watching him like she had been expecting him since before the bus left the terminal. Julian's fingers tightened around the edge of his cardboard box. Got Mrs. Dalton's eyes flicked to the box and back. "You've been brought low," she said, not as an insult, but as an observation. "That happens." Julian's jaw clenched. "Someone sent me here. I don't know why." Mrs. Dalton leaned forward slightly. "You do," she said quietly. Julian stared at her. He felt anger rise, hot and defensive. "I don't." Mrs. Dalton's expression remained calm. "You want to tell yourself you're here because of betrayal, because you were framed, because your right hand turned on you." She tilted her head. "All of that may be true, but that's not why you're here." Julian's chest tightened. "Then why?" Mrs. Dalton's eyes held his. "Because you finally ran out of people who owe you." The words landed in Julian's body like a hard truth. He felt it settle into his ribs. In his old life, favors were debts. Loyalty was a transaction. Even friendship had invisible invoices. Now he was surrounded by people who had nothing to gain from him. That was what terrified him. Micah shifted in his chair, listening. Mrs. Dalton's gaze flicked to Micah. "You'll stay here," she told him. "You'll eat, you'll sleep, you'll talk to Carla in the morning. She'll get your information sorted." Micah's eyes widened. "I can stay?" Mrs. Dalton nodded. "Yes." Micah looked down, swallowing hard. For a moment, his tough mask cracked, and Julian saw the child underneath it. The child who had been waiting at a bus station for someone who never showed. Micah's voice was small. "Do I have to leave him?" He jerked his head slightly toward Julian. Julian's throat tightened. He hadn't expected the question to hurt. Mrs. Dalton considered. "Micah, you don't have to take care of him," she said. "You're not responsible for adults." Micah's eyes stayed on Julian. "He looks like he's going to fall apart." Julian's jaw clenched. Because Micah was right. Mrs. Dalton's voice softened by a fraction. "He'll be handled." Julian flinched at the word handled. He had handled people his entire life. Mrs. Dalton turned back to Julian. "Now," she said, "tell me why you brought the boy." Julian hesitated. He was alone. Mrs. Dalton's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's not enough. Men like you don't suddenly start doing the right thing because you noticed loneliness." Julian's face burned. He felt exposed in a way he hadn't felt even under investigation. "I don't know," he said, voice rough. "He offered me water, food. He didn't have to." Mrs. Dalton watched him, waiting. Julian swallowed. "And he stopped. His throat tightened. "I realized I've walked past a lot of people like him." Mrs. Dalton leaned back. "Yes, you have." Julian's hands trembled slightly. He forced them still. "I didn't come here to be judged." Mrs. Dalton's eyes sharpened. "You didn't come here to be comforted either." She pointed toward the hall. "This is not your penthouse, M.R. Mercer. Here, people survive without your money. They survive without your approval. They survive without your name." Julian's chest tightened. Mrs. Dalton continued. "Someone sent you because they knew you would listen here. Not because I'm special, but because this place has nothing you can buy." Julian's heart pounded. "Who sent me?" Mrs. Dalton's gaze held his for a moment longer. Then she stood. "Wait here," she said. She stepped out of the office and closed the door behind her. Julian sat rigid in the chair, breathing shallowly. Micah stared at him. Julian tried to speak, but words felt useless. Footsteps returned. The door opened. A man stepped inside. He was in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, tall, lean, with a face that looked carved by cold weather and long work. His eyes were sharp and steady. His hands were rough, knuckles scarred. Julian recognized him immediately, not from the diner, not from the bus terminal, from a memory he hadn't allowed himself to revisit in years. The man closed the door behind him and stood in front of Julian without sitting, without smiling. Micah stiffened in his chair, watching the tension like a live wire. The man spoke first. "You don't remember me," he said calmly. "But I remember you." Julian's mouth went dry. The man lifted a hand, stopping him. "No," he said. "You don't get to fill the silence with excuses. Not here." Julian's chest tightened. His mind searched, frantic, for the memory. Then it hit. A former employee. A mid-level analyst in Meridian's risk department. A man named Daniel Hargrove. Julian remembered the day he fired him. A day of polished floors and rain against glass. Daniel had stood in Julian's office, with a folder in his hands, trembling slightly. He had come with concerns. He had come with warnings about the kind of aggressive lending and synthetic trades that could collapse if the market turned. He had come trying to protect the firm. Julian had laughed at him. Not loud, not cruel in an obvious way. Just a low, dismissive chuckle that told Daniel he was naive. "You're scared," Julian had said. "That's fine. But don't bring fear into my office and call it integrity. Daniel had swallowed hard and said, "It's not fear. It's risk. It's ethics." Julian had leaned forward, eyes cold. Ethics are for men who can't win. 2 days later, Daniel was escorted out with a box of his desk items. His reputation quietly poisoned by whispers Julian allowed to spread. Risk-averse, not a team player, unstable. Daniel's career never recovered. Julian hadn't thought about him since. Now Daniel Hargrove stood in front of him, not angry, not triumphant, just present, like a judge who didn't need a gavel. Julian's voice came out hoarse. "Daniel." Daniel's eyes flicked slightly, acknowledging the name. "So you do remember." Julian swallowed hard. "You sent the ticket." Daniel nodded once. "Yes." Julian's hands trembled. "Why?" Daniel's gaze held his. "Because when I saw your face on that news screen, ruined and hunted, I expected to feel satisfied." His voice stayed calm, but something heavy lived underneath it. "I expected it to feel like justice, but it didn't." Julian's chest tightened. He stared at Daniel, unable to speak. Daniel continued, "I live with what you did, every day. I lost my job. I lost my health insurance. My wife left because the pressure broke us. I slept in my car for 3 weeks. I ate from vending machines when I could afford it." He paused. "And you forgot me." Julian flinched. Shame surged through him, hot and sickening. He wanted to say he was sorry, but the words felt too small, too easy. Daniel's eyes flicked to Micah, softening slightly. "And then I saw you at the bus terminal," he said, "holding that box like a man drowning. And I saw the boy." He looked back at Julian. "I saw you hand him a bill. I saw him hand you water. I saw you drink like you hadn't allowed yourself to be human in years." Julian's throat tightened. "You were there." Daniel nodded. "I was." Mrs. Dalton stood by the door, quiet, letting the moment unfold. Julian whispered, "Why help me? After everything?" Daniel took a slow breath. "Because I know what it's like to have your life collapse," he said. "And because I'm tired of becoming the kind of man you taught me to be." Julian stared, confused. Daniel's voice stayed steady, but his eyes held pain. "After you fired me, I lived with bitterness, so long it became a personality. I started seeing people the way you see them, as obstacles, as threats, as things to protect myself from." He paused. "And it made me smaller." Julian felt the words sink into him. He had made someone smaller, not just with money and power, with the example of who he had been. Daniel continued, "So when I saw you fall, I had a choice. I could watch you get destroyed and call it fairness." He held Julian's gaze. "Or I could do one quiet thing that proved I still had a soul." Julian's breath caught. Micah shifted in his chair. His eyes bounced between Julian and Daniel, trying to make sense of it. "You're the one helping him?" Micah asked. Daniel looked at Micah and nodded. "Yes." Micah's brow furrowed. "But he hurt you." Daniel nodded again. "Yes." Micah's voice went small. "Then why?" Daniel's gaze softened. "Because helping doesn't mean what happened was okay," he said. "It means I refuse to let what happened turn me into someone who only knows how to hate." Micah stared, absorbing that like a lesson too big for a 10-year-old. Julian felt something shift in his chest, like a locked door cracking open. He forced words out. "Daniel, I don't know how to fix what I did." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "You can't fix it," he said. "Not fully. Some things don't get fixed." He paused. "But you can face it. You can stop hiding behind the story that you're only a victim." Julian flinched. Daniel stepped closer, voice low. "You were betrayed," he said. "Yes. Welcome to the life you gave everyone else. You built your empire on fear and pressure, on people swallowing their pain so your numbers could look clean." Julian's throat burned. His eyes stung. He felt tears rising, and he hated himself for it, hated how late his humanity was arriving. Daniel's voice softened slightly. "I'm not here to forgive you," he said. "Not today. Maybe not ever. That's not the point." He glanced at Micah. "The point is that a child shouldn't be alone in a terminal at 217A. And a man shouldn't have to be destroyed to remember he's human." Julian's breath shuddered. Mrs. Dalton finally spoke. "You're staying here tonight," she told Julian. "You'll get a bed in the men's dorm. You'll follow the rules. You'll be quiet. And tomorrow, you will start doing what you've avoided your entire life." Julian looked up, blinking. "What is that?" Mrs. Dalton's eyes held his. "Listening," she said. "Without defending yourself. Without negotiating. Without buying your way out." Julian swallowed hard. Daniel stepped back slightly. "Caleb isn't done," he said. "He's trying to erase evidence by erasing you. You need protection." Julian's chest tightened again. "You can protect me?" Daniel's expression stayed calm. "I can help," quietly. He looked at Julian like a man reading a balance sheet. "But you need to decide something first," Julian whispered. "What?" Daniel's voice was low, firm. "Are you trying to survive so you can rebuild the same empire somewhere else?" He paused. "Or are you trying to survive so you can become someone different?" Julian stared at him, the question slicing through every excuse. Micah's eyes stayed on Julian, waiting. Mrs. Dalton waited too. Julian looked down at his cardboard box. A watch, a skyline photo, papers that used to mean power, symbols of a man he had been. Julian felt his throat tighten, and finally, he said the only honest thing he could. "I don't know how to be someone different," he whispered, "but I don't want to be that man anymore." Daniel held his gaze for a long beat, then nodded once, as if that answer was the first real currency Julian had offered in years. "Good," Daniel said quietly. "Then this is where your redemption starts." Julian Mercer woke up to the sound of a broom scraping concrete. For a second, his mind tried to place him back in his penthouse, where mornings began with filtered sunlight and silent service. Then the smell hit him. Industrial cleaner, stale coffee, damp coats drying on hooks. He opened his eyes to a low ceiling and a narrow bed with a thin blanket pulled up to his chest. A shelter bunk. The reality landed in his body like a cold truth. He sat up slowly, shoulders tense, listening. Men murmured nearby. Someone coughed deep and wet. A heater rattled as it struggled against the winter damp. A small clock on the wall ticked louder than it should have. Julian looked down at his hands and felt a strange disorientation. These hands had signed contracts worth billions. They had shaken other powerful hands in rooms where people whispered his name like it meant certainty. Now these hands clutched a cheap blanket and tried not to tremble. He stood, careful not to wake the older man sleeping in the bunk beside him, and followed the hallway toward the main area. The shelter was already awake. Volunteers moved with practiced speed. A few residents lined up for coffee. A woman behind a counter slid bowls of oatmeal forward like she was feeding an army. No one bowed. No one rushed to impress him. No one flinched at his mood. It was the most honest environment Julian had been in for years. Mrs. Dalton spotted him from across the room. She did not wave. She pointed at a sink. "Wash up," she said. "Then you work." Julian's jaw tightened on instinct. Work meant hierarchy. Work meant he gave orders. Work meant he stayed above the mess. Mrs. Dalton's eyes narrowed. "You heard me, Mr. Mercer." Julian swallowed whatever pride was still clinging to his ribs and walked to the sink. The water was lukewarm. The soap smelled cheap and sharp. He rubbed his palms together until they were raw, not because they were dirty, but because he wanted to scrub off the feeling of being watched. When he turned, Mrs. Dalton handed him a pair of gloves and a plastic apron. "You're on breakfast cleanup," she said. "And then you're sorting donated coats." Julian stared at the apron like it was a joke. "I don't know how to do that, Mrs. Dalton's expression stayed flat. "Then you'll learn. People learn fast when they stop pretending they're special." A few residents glanced at him, curious. One man with a bruised cheek smirked, as if he could smell Julian's discomfort. Julian felt heat rise in his face. In his old world, he could have ended this with a phone call, a donation, a speech about rehabilitation and community. Here, speeches were useless. Julian took the apron and put it on. He started with trays, scraping leftover oatmeal into a bin. The work was simple, repetitive, humbling. And it did something unexpected. It gave his mind a place to rest that wasn't fear. He worked without looking up, trying to avoid attention, until a small voice near the doorway made his shoulders stiffen. Micah stood there in a borrowed sweatshirt that was too big and clean sneakers someone had clearly found in a donation pile. He held a paper cup of milk and stared at Julian, as if Julian had become a confusing part of the shelter's landscape. Julian paused, glove dripping with soapy water. "Hey," he said quietly. Micah walked closer, eyes scanning Julian's apron like he couldn't believe it. "You're doing dishes," Micah said. Julian nodded once. "Looks like it." Micah's face stayed guarded, but his eyes carried something else. Relief, maybe, mixed with disbelief. "You're not leaving?" Micah asked. Julian opened his mouth, then closed it. The truth was, Julian didn't know what leaving even meant anymore. There was no home to return to, no loyal team waiting, no clean escape route. "I'm here," Julian said finally. "For now." Micah nodded like he was filing the information away for later. Then he lowered his voice. "Mrs. Dalton said I might talk to someone about school." Julian's stomach tightened. "That's good." Micah stared at Julian's hands. "You look different," he said. Julian almost laughed. "I feel different." Micah tilted his head. "Is it because you're scared?" Julian swallowed. "Yes." Micah looked down at his milk, then back up. "Good," he said simply. Julian blinked. "Good?" Micah's voice remained calm, like a small judge delivering a verdict. "If you're scared, you won't do the bad stuff so easy." Julian felt the words hit him hard. Children weren't supposed to understand human behavior this accurately. But Micah did, because he had lived under adults who did bad stuff easily. Micah walked away without another word, and Julian stood there, holding a wet tray, feeling something heavy shift inside him. Mrs. Dalton appeared at his shoulder. "He's watching you," she said. Julian kept his eyes on the sink. "I noticed." Mrs. Dalton's voice dropped. "Children like that don't trust what you say. They trust what you do." Julian nodded once, his throat too tight to speak. By mid-morning, Daniel Hargrove returned. He entered through the blue door with quiet purpose, like a man who had trained himself not to waste motion. He spoke briefly with Mrs. Dalton in the office. Then he found Julian in the back room sorting coats by size and condition. Julian looked up and froze for a second, shame rising again. Daniel had once worn a dress shirt in Meridian Tower. Now he wore a work jacket with frayed cuffs. Daniel held a folded newspaper in one hand and a phone in the other. "They found a body near your building," he said, voice low. Julian's stomach dropped. "What?" Daniel's eyes stayed steady. "Not yours. Someone else. A messenger type. Caleb's cleaning up." Julian felt cold spread under his skin. "I didn't ask for this." Daniel's expression tightened. "Of course you didn't. Nobody asks for a predator to turn on them." He paused. "But you did build a system where predators thrive." Julian flinched. Daniel stepped closer. "Law enforcement is moving," he said, "but you have to cooperate, fully. No spinning. No protecting your image. Your image is ash." Julian's jaw clenched. "They think I'm guilty." Daniel nodded. Many people think you're guilty of plenty. The fraud may not be yours. The harm is. Julian stared at the coats in his hands. A child's jacket, patched at the elbow. A woman's coat missing 2 buttons. Clothing that had survived longer than dignity sometimes did. Julian whispered, "If I cooperate, Caleb will come for me harder." Daniel's voice stayed calm. "Yes." Julian looked up, desperate. "Then why are you doing this?" Daniel's gaze did not soften this time. "Because I don't want Micah to grow up learning the same lesson you taught me." He paused. "And because I have something you never understood. Nothing left to lose." Julian's throat tightened. That kind of courage made Julian feel small. Daniel handed him the phone. "A detective wants to talk." Julian stared at the phone like it weighed 100 pounds. In his old life, he would have controlled this call through attorneys and public relations. He would have crafted a narrative. Now Daniel was asking him to speak without armor. Julian took the phone. The detective's voice was clipped and tired. He asked about Caleb, about signatures, about meetings, about the compliance reports Daniel had once tried to warn Julian about. Julian answered plainly. When he didn't know, he said he didn't know. When he remembered something ugly, he admitted it. The honesty felt like stepping barefoot onto broken glass. It hurt, and it also felt clean. When the call ended, Julian's hands were shaking. Daniel watched him. "That's the first time you told the truth without trying to win," he said. Julian swallowed. "It felt like dying." Daniel nodded. "That's your ego. Let it die." Mrs. Dalton entered the room with a clipboard. "The shelter board is nervous," she said. "Your name brings reporters in trouble." Julian's stomach tightened. "I'll leave." Mrs. Dalton studied him. "You could, and you should, if you're only thinking about yourself." Julian stiffened. "I'm not." Mrs. Dalton raised an eyebrow. "Then prove it." Julian stared at her, confused. She tapped the clipboard. "If you stay, you follow my rules. You sleep where I tell you. You work where I tell you. You do not pull rank. You do not make speeches. You do not use this place as a redemption stage." Julian's jaw clenched. "And if reporters come?" Mrs. Dalton's voice hardened. "Then you take the heat outside, and you keep the shelter safe. You finally absorb consequences instead of exporting them." Julian's chest tightened. He nodded once. "Okay." Mrs. Dalton's eyes narrowed, as if she was waiting for the old Julian to argue. When he didn't, something faint shifted in her expression. Not kindness, but recognition. Later that afternoon, Julian stepped outside into the cold to take out trash. A simple task, a humiliating task for a former billionaire. A task nobody noticed. As he walked toward the dumpster, he saw a familiar figure across the street. The older man from the bus terminal sat on a low wall with his hands tucked into his coat, watching the shelter like it mattered. He nodded at Julian once, the same silent acknowledgement as before. Julian hesitated, then walked closer. "You were at the terminal," Julian said. The man's eyes remained on the building. "Yes, you've been around," Julian said. "The diner." "The terminal. Here." The man shrugged. "This is my part of town." Julian swallowed. "Why are you watching me?" The man finally looked at him. His gaze was rough, honest. "Because men like you don't change," he said. "They perform." Julian felt heat rise. "I'm not performing." The man's mouth twitched slightly, not a smile. "Then stop trying to convince people," he said. "Just do the work, quietly, for a long time." Julian stared at him. "What's your name?" The man paused. "Elias." Julian's mind searched and came up empty. He had expected recognition, some old lawsuit, some dismissed complaint, something. He said carefully, "I don't remember you." Elias nodded, unsurprised. "No, you wouldn't." Julian felt a pit open in his stomach. "Did I hurt you too?" Elias looked away. You hurt a lot of people, he said. Some of us learned to survive anyway. Julian swallowed hard. Why help me then? Elias's voice dropped. Because I saw the boy, he said simply. And because sometimes a man's punishment isn't losing everything. He glanced at Julian. Sometimes it's being given one more chance to become someone worth remembering. Julian stood frozen, trash bag hanging heavy in his hands. Then Elias added, quieter, sharper, and because Caleb called me this morning. Julian's blood went cold. What? Elias's eyes hardened. He offered me money to tell him where you are. Julian's mouth went dry. And you didn't. Elias stared at him. I didn't take his money, he said. But don't confuse that with loyalty. I didn't do it for you. Julian's heart hammered. Then why? Elias's gaze flicked toward the shelter door, toward the warmth inside, toward Micah somewhere behind those walls. For him, Elias said. Julian's throat tightened. Caleb is coming. Elias nodded once. Yes. Julian's mind flashed with images. Suits in the night, violence in quiet places, a system that erased people when they became inconvenient. He looked at the shelter, suddenly seeing it as fragile. A safe place built from rules and stubborn compassion. A safe place Caleb could shatter. Daniel emerged from the blue door, scanning the street. His eyes locked on Julian's face. He read the panic instantly. What? Daniel asked, stepping closer. Julian's voice came out tight. Elias says Caleb is looking for me. He's offering money. Daniel's jaw clenched. Then we move you. Julian's chest tightened. No, he said. Daniel stared at him. What do you mean, no? Julian looked at the shelter door, at the people inside who had nothing to do with his war, at Micah, who had finally found a blanket and a meal and a chance at school. Julian swallowed hard. If I run again, he'll follow, Julian said. And he'll bring it here next time. He'll endanger them. Daniel's eyes narrowed. So what's your plan? Julian's hands shook, but his voice steadied as he spoke. I face him, he said. Daniel's expression tightened. You don't even have a lawyer. Julian nodded once. I know, he said. I also don't have a mask anymore. He looked at Daniel. And I'm done making other people pay for what I built. Daniel held his gaze for a long beat. Then Daniel's phone buzzed. He checked the screen, and the color drained from his face. Julian's stomach dropped. What is it? Daniel lifted the phone slightly so Julian could see the message. A photo of the shelter's blue door from across the street. A new text beneath it. Tell Mercer to come out. O.R. The boy goes back to the station. Julian's blood turned to ice. He turned toward the blue door, toward Micah inside. And for the first time since his empire collapsed, Julian Mercer felt something stronger than fear. A fierce, unbuyable, unnegotiable determination. Julian Mercer did not move for a full second. The photo of the blue door on Daniel's phone felt like a gun pointed at the shelter's heart. The message beneath, it was not just a threat. It was a reminder of who Caleb Rourke truly was when there were no cameras, no boardrooms, no polished speeches about ethics. Tell Mercer to come out. O.R. The boy goes back to the station. Julian's first impulse was to run. His body knew how to run. Running had been his oldest survival skill, long before wealth. Run from poverty, run from shame, run from feelings, run from anyone who could see the man behind the suit. But he didn't. He looked at the blue door, at the light above it trembling in the mist, at the shelter that had given Micah a blanket and oatmeal and a chance at school with no contract attached. This place had rules. Respect is not optional. Julian swallowed hard. Then he said quietly to Daniel, he's using Micah to pull me outside. Daniel's jaw was tight. I know. Mrs. Dalton stepped out behind them, her face calm in the way only deeply experienced people can be calm. She didn't ask questions first. She asked for facts. Where is the boy? Inside. Julian said. With staff. Mrs. Dalton nodded once. Then we keep him inside. We do not trade children for monsters. Julian flinched at the word monsters, but he deserved it. Elias stood near the curb, hands in his coat pockets. He looked at Daniel's phone, then at Julian. That's Caleb's style, Elias said. He threatens the weak because he's terrified of real consequences. Julian's voice came out rough. He'll hurt someone. Daniel looked at Julian, then made a decision. Mars. Dalton, he said. Lock the front. Switch the entrance to the side. Move Micah to the back room with Carla. No windows. Mrs. Dalton was already turning. Carla, she called into the shelter, voice crisp. Back room now. No arguments. Julian's chest tightened. He stepped toward the door, then stopped, because he knew he would only bring danger closer if he went inside. He stood in the cold, hands shaking at his sides, staring at the blue door like it was the only good thing he had ever touched. Daniel pulled Julian slightly away from the entrance. Listen to me, Daniel said. We do not do this alone. Caleb wants you isolated. Julian swallowed. Then call the detective again. Daniel nodded. He already had his phone up, already dialing. Julian looked at Elias. You said Caleb called you. Why did he think you could find me? Elias's eyes narrowed slightly. Because I know his habits, he said. And because I used to clean up after men like him? Julian stared. What does that mean? Elias did not answer directly. It means I know where he likes to stand when he thinks he's untouchable. Daniel returned from the call, face hard. Detective Alvarez is 20 minutes out. 2 squad cars. Julian felt his stomach drop. 20 minutes is too long. Daniel looked at Julian. Then we buy time. Quietly, Julian's mind raced. In the past, he would have bought time with lawyers and leverage. Now he had nothing but honesty and a shelter full of people he didn't want harmed. He looked at Daniel. He wants me outside. Daniel's eyes narrowed. No, Julian's voice steadied, surprising even himself. Yes, he said, but not near the shelter. Elias gave a small nod, like he had been waiting for Julian to say that. There's an alley behind the diner, Elias said. Cameras on the street side, blind spot inside. If Caleb's watching this door, we pull his attention away. Daniel's jaw tightened. And if he's not alone? Elias's gaze was flat. He won't come alone. Julian's hands shook, but he lifted his chin. Then I go with a microphone, he said. Daniel stared. What? Julian pulled his phone out. The battery was low, but still alive. If he's hunting me, he'll talk. Caleb can't resist explaining himself. He'll want credit. Daniel's eyes sharpened. You're thinking like him. Julian swallowed. I'm using what I learned, so he can't do this again. Daniel hesitated for one tight beat, and nodded. Record everything. Mrs. Dalton returned to the doorway, keys in hand, her face like stone. Micah is safe, she said. He's frightened, but safe. Julian's throat tightened. Tell him I'm not leaving him. Mrs. Dalton looked at Julian for a long moment. Do not make promises you cannot keep, she said. Julian held her gaze. Then I'll keep this one. Daniel lowered his voice. We move now. Elias lead. Elias walked first, not fast, not slow, like a man who knew that panic makes you sloppy. Julian followed. Daniel closed behind. They moved along the side street, keeping the shadows, cutting behind the diner. The mist clung to Julian's hair and eyelashes. The cold sharpened his breath. They reached the alley Elias had mentioned. It smelled like wet cardboard and grease. A single security light buzzed above a back door. The diner's kitchen vent hummed, pushing warm air into the cold. Julian's heart pounded. His fingers tightened around his phone. He pressed record. Daniel whispered, Say as little as possible. Let him talk. Julian nodded once. Then a voice came from the mouth of the alley, smooth as a handshake. There he is. Caleb Rourke stepped into view. He wore a dark coat, collar turned up, hair perfectly styled despite the mist. His face was calm, almost disappointed, as if Julian had missed a meeting instead of escaping a threat. Behind him, two men lingered in the street shadows. Not close, but close enough. Caleb looked Julian up and down like a product that had been damaged. "You look terrible," he said. Julian's jaw clenched. "What do you want, Caleb?" Caleb smiled faintly. "Still calling me Caleb," he said. "After everything?" He sighed as if Julian were being difficult. "I want you to stop making this messy." Julian kept his voice level. "You framed me." Caleb's expression didn't change. "I organized the story," Caleb said. "You provided the reputation. People believed it because you trained them to." Julian felt the words land like a punch. He forced himself not to react. He let silence sit. Caleb tilted his head. "You brought a child into this," Caleb said, voice almost scolding. "That shelter, that boy, that was impulsive." Julian's hands trembled, but his eyes stayed on Caleb. "Leave Micah out of it." Caleb's smile sharpened slightly. "Micah," he repeated, tasting the name. "You learned it." "How sentimental." He stepped closer, shoes splashing softly in a puddle. "Listen, Julian, we can end this. You sign a statement. You take full responsibility. You disappear somewhere quiet, and I make sure you stay breathing." Julian's stomach tightened. "And if I don't?" Caleb's eyes hardened just a fraction. "Then you become an example, and I don't mean in the papers." Daniel's muscles tensed beside Julian. Julian swallowed, then forced his voice steady. "You sent those messages. The threats." Caleb shrugged. "Motivation," he said. "You respond well to pressure." "I learned that from you." Julian's throat burned. He realized, with nauseating clarity, that Caleb wasn't just betraying him. Caleb was mirroring him, using Julian's own methods, refined and sharpened. Julian lifted his chin. "Why are you doing this?" Caleb laughed softly. "Because you were getting weak," he said. "You were starting to listen to people like Daniel. People like compliance. People like conscience." He shook his head. "That kind of softness kills profit." "I protected the machine." Julian held very still. "So you destroyed me to save your system." Caleb's smile returned. "I destroyed you because you were the only risk I couldn't manage," he said. "You were unpredictable once you started feeling things." Julian felt his eyes sting. He blinked hard. "You threatened a child?" Caleb's face remained calm. "Children are leverage," he said. "The world runs on leverage." Julian's jaw clenched so hard it hurt. He glanced at the two men in the street shadows, then back to Caleb. "You already took my company," Julian said. "My name, my life. What else do you want?" Caleb stepped closer until he was inside Julian's personal space. His voice lowered. "I want your silence," he said. "Because if you talk, you don't just ruin me. You ruin the kind of world you built. And deep down, you still want that world to exist." Julian felt the moment stretch. In his old life, Caleb's words would have hit a hidden nerve. Julian would have protected the machine because the machine had protected him, but he wasn't protected anymore. And Micah's face flashed in his mind, the way he had said, "Good, if you're scared, you won't do the bad stuff so easy." Julian looked Caleb in the eye. "You're wrong," he said. Caleb's expression tightened. "Am I?" Julian's voice was quiet, firm. "That world doesn't get to exist anymore," he said. "Not through me." Caleb stared at him for a beat, then his calm cracked into irritation. "You think this is redemption?" Caleb snapped. "Washing dishes in a shelter? Sorting coats? You're still the same man, Julian. You just changed costumes." Julian felt the accusation slice deep because it was the exact fear he had been carrying. That he was performing. That he was only trying to feel better. He swallowed hard and said the truth anyway. Maybe I am still the same man, Julian said. But I'm done letting that man lead. Caleb's eyes narrowed. He glanced toward the street and made a small motion with 2 fingers. One of the men shifted closer. Daniel's body tightened. Julian's breath caught. Then, from somewhere behind Caleb, blue and red lights flashed across the mist. A voice shouted from the street, "Police! Hands where I can see them." Caleb froze for half a second. The irritation vanished, replaced by calculation. He lifted his hands slowly and smiled like a man about to charm his way out of consequences. "Officers," Caleb called, smooth. "This is a misunderstanding." Detective Alvarez stepped into view with 2 uniformed officers. Her eyes went straight to Caleb, then to Julian. Mercer, she said, voice clipped. "Step back." Julian obeyed immediately. Alvarez looked at Caleb. "Caleb Rourke," she said. "You are under arrest for witness intimidation, threats, and obstruction. We also have probable cause related to the assault near Meridian's building." Caleb's smile stayed in place, but his eyes hardened. "You're making a mistake," he said. Detective Alvarez didn't flinch. "Turn around." As the officers moved in, Caleb's gaze locked on Julian. The smile finally dropped. What remained was cold contempt. "This is what you are," Caleb said softly. "A man who destroys everything he touches." Julian's throat tightened. He wanted to argue. He wanted to scream. He wanted to defend himself. Instead, he kept recording until the officers took Caleb's phone, turned him, and cuffed him. When Caleb was led away, the alley felt suddenly quiet. The diner vent hummed. The security light buzzed. Mist drifted like breath. Detective Alvarez approached Julian. "Do you have anything to give me?" she asked. "That proves he threatened you?" Julian lifted his phone with shaking hands. "I recorded it," he said. Alvarez nodded once. Professional, efficient. "Good," she said. Then she looked Julian in the eye. "Now tell me everything, not just about him." Her voice sharpened. "About you." Julian felt the weight of the moment settle in his bones. Because this was the part where redemption stopped being traumatic and became expensive. He swallowed and nodded. "I will," he said. "All of it." Hours later, when Julian returned to the shelter, the sun was rising. The blue door looked the same. The light above it was still on, fading against daylight. Inside, the shelter smelled like coffee and toast, and the stubbornness of people who refused to let cruelty win. Micah was in the back room, wrapped in a blanket, eyes red from crying. When he saw Julian, he sat up fast, anger and relief battling on his face. Julian knelt in front of him, careful, slow, like a man learning how to be safe. Micah's voice trembled. "They said you were going to leave." Julian shook his head once. "I didn't," he said. "I'm here." Micah stared at him. "Are you going back to being bad again?" Julian felt tears sting his eyes, and this time he didn't fight them. "I'm going to try every day not to," he said honestly. "And I'm going to do the work, not talk about it." Micah's jaw clenched. Then he leaned forward and hugged Julian hard, fast, like a child grabbing a lifeline before it disappears. Julian closed his eyes and held him gently, feeling the reality of what he had almost lost. Mrs. Dalton stood in the doorway watching. She didn't smile, but her voice softened slightly. "Micah has a caseworker," she said. "A placement is coming. A real one." Julian swallowed. "Good." Daniel stood beside Mrs. Dalton. His eyes met Julian's. There was no forgiveness in them yet, but there was something else. Respect, earned by one hard choice. In the weeks that followed, Julian did not regain his empire. He didn't get a heroic comeback. There were hearings. There were lawsuits. There were faces from his past, full of anger he had earned. He sold what was left of his assets, not to rebuild power, but to fund restitution and legal support for employees harmed by Meridian's collapse. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough, but he kept working at the shelter anyway, quietly, consistently, without cameras. He washed dishes. He sorted coats. He listened to men whose names the world didn't care about. He learned how to say I was wrong without adding a defense. He learned how to sit in discomfort without trying to buy his way out. Micah got placed with a foster family that lived near the shelter, a couple who had been volunteering there for years. Micah still came by after school sometimes. He didn't call Julian a hero. He didn't romanticize him. He just watched him. And on one rainy afternoon, as Julian was stacking donated blankets, Micah walked up and handed him a crumpled piece of paper. It was a drawing. A blue door with a bright light above it. A small boy inside. A tall man outside, holding a cardboard box. But the box was open now, empty, like it had finally stopped being a shield. Micah looked up. "This is you," he said. Julian swallowed, voice thick. "Is it?" Micah nodded once. "Yeah," he said. "Because you came back." Julian stared at the drawing and felt the echo of redemption hum through him. Not loud, not clean, but real. In a world obsessed with revenge, the most powerful change was not the one that made headlines. It was the one that happened quietly, day after day, in the small choices no one clapped for. And Julian Mercer, once a man who trusted no one, began to build a different kind of legacy, one silent act of compassion at a time.